Hello, my name is CJ Toro, and I'm a high school statistics teacher, and I was watching the White House Coronavirus Task Force briefing yesterday, Friday, May 22nd, and I was struck by how consistently poor the data visualization practices of the presenters were. During a period of time in the country in which it is uniquely important that citizens understand the reality of the numbers underlying the current danger level of the pandemic, the most public outlet for those numbers is being run by people that would probably get C's in my high school Intro to Stats course. So in this video, I'm going to take you through every unique design that was used in that presentation by Deborah Birx and give feedback on some of the most noteworthy errors made by the creators of those viz. I should note that these graphs came from multiple sources, and I was able to find many of them on the CDC's page, but they were taken from other sources as well, some of whom do not make their data and viz publicly available. All right, we start with what I'm sorry to say is the last graph in the presentation that I probably would have given an A in my stats course. It's a fairly basic bar graph showing the daily deaths from COVID, and it's a bit strange that they abbreviated the thousands with Ks over here, and it's also a little bit strange that they didn't bother to eliminate the clearly useless legend, which just says daily deaths, but I don't mind either, and overall this viz is perfectly acceptable. It doesn't take long for our heroes to get driven off course, though, because the second graph appears to be a fairly straightforward depiction of hospitalizations by week, except, wait, why is there a massive gap between the two April bars here? We have a 2-week gap that's unexplained. The viewer probably doesn't even notice this gap because visually the bars are regularly spaced, indicating that there's nothing unusual to see here. But if you're like me, you probably recognize that there's 2 weeks missing in April, but 3 shown, and months don't have 5 weeks. So how is it that there's another April? Oh my God! 2 of the 4 bars in this graph are referencing overlapping periods of time for some reason. I can't imagine the justification for this, but it's either extremely confusing or extremely misleading depending on how the bins in those 2 bars are going to break down. This graph has gone from mildly concerning to completely useless because I have no idea what part of those middle 2 bars is in mid-April versus late April. So to mutilate the x-axis to such a straightforward graph is fairly inexcusable. We get a brief reprieve here with a forgivably mediocre viz showing the growth of flu-like and COVID-like diseases, with the flu-like being the blue and the COVID-like being the orange. So, and it's as a percent of emergency department visits over time. Mathematically, I don't have a big problem with this one, although I'm not 100% sure why the percentages were the way to go here. We're more interested in general growth rather than growth relative to other illnesses. So that's a little bit unusual, but as far as viz practice is concerned, the title is needlessly long. And the last line in particular is a source, so that should be moved down to the footnote somewhere, probably over here, right? That's a minor flaw, though. It's also bizarre that we're only 3 slides in, and somehow we've already hit our 3rd different date format. This one probably looks like gibberish at first glance. In reality, it's the year and the week number. It's just confusing because they're not separated by any dividing character or a space of any kind. So it just looks like 202014 or something like that. It's not particularly harmful, but it's just so lazy. When was the last time you talked to friends and scheduled something for week number 42? Never, of course not, because you're not a sociopath, right? We think in months and days, and axes should normally reflect that. So the title problem is back here, right? And this time that matters a little bit more because I don't actually know what this graph is designed to show us. It looks like the takeaway should be that flu-like illnesses are down below the baseline as a percentage of ED visits. So that's right down here. But it doesn't tell much about COVID, and Birx identified the second orange peak, that's this thing right here, right, as the COVID outbreak, which is confusing since this graph is showing flu-like illnesses, not COVID-like illnesses. It's possible that I'm misunderstanding either the classifications or what she meant by that, so I'm not saying she's wrong. What I'm saying is that this confusion would have been avoided with a better data visualization. The other thing that I would have made clear is what the peaks and valleys, whether or not the peaks and valleys are in flu season. So you can do that by taking that brace, this little thing right here, and just extending it down with a translucency. Right, makes the data much easier to see as it pertains to the flu season, particularly the data that's down here. It wasn't clear which parts were in the season and not. So this was the first of several graphs showing flu-like activity per state. My main gripe here is color choices, right? Firstly, they have no units and 5 classes, minimal, low, moderate, high, and very high, but somehow those 5 classes have been split into 13 colors. Secondly, this looks like a dichromatic color scale. That means 2 colors. So the green to red scale is popular, though problematic for reasons I'll get to in a second. It's very unusual, however, to see a single purple index right here in a red-green color scale. Green and blue are normally low danger levels because they're cool and calm, and red would normally be a high one for obvious reasons. But curling back to a cool color at the top of the cool to hot scale is unconventional, and it doesn't add anything to the viz except for potential confusion. I mentioned the red-green color scale problem earlier. The reason is because red-green color blindness is actually the most common type. So if you look at the colors, for instance, in Florida and California, those are green and orange. They're very different, opposite ends of the spectrum in this scale. But if you suffer from red-green color blindness, the type that affects 2.5% of men in the country, that means that 1 in 100 viewers probably saw a graph that looked something like this. Look at California and Florida again, right? Remember they were supposed to be at opposite ends of the spectrum? Yeah, that's a problem. All right, now we move on from the flu onto the main attraction, which is COVID-19. In this one, we once again sidestep downright harmful misinformation and just opt for laziness instead. If you've been paying attention to this coverage at all, you probably know that New York has been the epicenter of the pandemic, yet you can't see New York in this graph. Why? Because the axis has decided that it's only going to show every other state. This is an easy fix for any software. You could have reduced the font size, or even better, just made the states vertical instead of diagonal. Again, it's not terrible, it's just lazy. I also don't like this title, starting with a percent as opposed to a capital letter word, and the y-axis does not clearly indicate a percent because the y-axis wasn't labeled. So if you have to not label the y-axis and you have to put a title, I would have done something like this instead. I think it's a little bit easier to read. Okay, strap in, folks, because this one's a doozy. We're looking at testing results by state here, and step 1 is to zoom in because I can't see a damn thing in this, the way that they presented it to the public. All right, marginally better. All right, so this graph probably seems really busy to some of you. The reason is that this is actually 2 completely unrelated graphs superimposed on one another. First, we have the raw count of positive and negative results shown by the red, blue, and gray bars measured by the right axis. Then we have the percent of all tests that were positive at 2 different rolling averages, as shown as the weird floating pluses and diamonds also measured in red and blue, though unrelated to the coinciding colors in the bars. There's almost never a good reason for dual axes, unless they're showing 2 different units of the same measurement, like say feet and inches. Percentages are actually okay if the denominator of the percentage doesn't change across the x-axis, but the denominator does change here, so the floating symbols can't be compared to the bars with which they share a column in any meaningful way. This should have been 2 separate graphs. Also, not for nothing, but why have we used blue for 2 different things and red for 2 different things if those things are completely unrelated? Shouldn't the red and blue, and also shouldn't the red and blue be opposite and the gray neutral, rather than gray meaning negative and that being the opposite of red? It's not a particularly egregious error as 2 graphs in one, but it's still weird and avoidable. So weird, in fact, that they actually fixed it in the next graph. We've got reds on the top and blues on the bottom now, reds being the symbols, blues being the bars. So this graph shows the daily case counts per 100,000 people in 10 metro areas. And I don't actually have a mathematical problem with this one, but the legend clearly has too much information, right? This is out of hand. And it's hard to relate the legend to the graph itself because there's so many colors, and there's a lot of data viz packages that would make this more manageable. The one that I would use would be ggRepel in R. But basically, long story short, I would have changed it to look something like this. It's easier for the viewer to see what metro areas are being referenced, and it's easier to see how they relate to the given lines in the graph. So I've got to say, I've never seen a graph quite like this one. we have rolling averages of case totals in the New York metro area, and to differentiate between counties, rather than choosing many different colors, or perhaps one color for New York and one for New Jersey, which would have been helpful, they opted to cycle through 6 different shades of red. And they did that 1, 2.5 times? But anything more than 2.5 would have been crazy, so instead of going through 3 full cycles, let's cut it off at half and collapse the remaining 5 counties into one of the 6 shades of red, the 3 of them of which have been used twice. There's no problem with the math, but this is just a truly bizarre decision that I can only assume was made by an intern that thought this graph looked cool. Another busy graph here, which means that, yes, we're back to the dreaded dual axis. My problems with this one are the same as my problems with the first one. I don't even know how they got this random meaning floating list percent sign as well to replace the 0. And the legend also makes it very hard to tell which is labeling a line versus a bar. I mean, like, if you're going to do dual axis, why not group them together in the legend? For them, they put the bars in the middle and distinguished it from the lines in no way. They're all just colored rectangles. No big problem with this one. I don't think it's particularly informative, but other than having the legend incorrectly depict these as open inequalities rather than non-overlapping intervals, is fine. All right, notorious in data viz circles, no poorly done statistical presentation would be complete without a pie chart. We generally like to avoid these entirely, but if the goal was to show that half of the cases in this state were from community spread and half of the remaining contained outbreaks were from meatpacking, then I'll forgive it because it does effectively represent that. Once again, though, whoever's in charge of the colors needs to be fired because we have 3 blue categories and 3 gray categories and 1 red. These groups mean nothing, and the red sticks out like a sore thumb for no reason. Dr. Brooks didn't even mention prison in her analysis. Also, a bonus mathematical annoyance here is that they mentioned 76% of deaths coming from contained outbreaks, but they fail to note that most of that is going to be from nursing homes, which are responsible for a disproportionate percent of that. This makes it seem like all of the contained outbreaks are going to be more dangerous than the community spread ones, which, even if true, is exaggerated by the figure. We finish with a graph only mildly concerning. An already busy batch of colors gets made worse by needlessly long legends and a title from someone speaking English for the first time, I'm assuming. Uh, Again, at least it's not mathematically misleading like some of the previous ones. All right, so that's all of the graphs that they showed in the presentation, but I want to briefly summarize some of the biggest no-nos of their viz before signing off here. So first of all, you should make the titles and legends easy to read. Less is more. They didn't do that, right? Too many times they added source to the titles and data to the legends. These things need to be quick and easy so that the viewer can get to the actually hard task of interpreting the dense graphs. 2. Make the axes intuitive, consistent, and readable. Once again, something that they did not do. Pick a date format that people recognize and stick with it. If the axes are categories, then choose orientations and sizes for the font that allow you to label all of them. The reader shouldn't have to put in any effort into reading axes, so putting effort in would be a no-no. Make meaningful choices when assigning colors. Don't do it randomly or because it looks pretty. So that would be a no-no. Is there more than one shade of blue in the graph? Then what does the blue category mean and how is it distinct from the non-blue categories? Is it a color-based scale? What are the poles of that scale and do they make sense? Is it colorblind friendly? All of these are questions that you should be asking before making these. Limit the categories shown to only what is discernible at a glance. So can you tell the difference between the 23rd and 24th highest counties in your graph? No? Then maybe just limit it to the top 10. And finally, dual axes. Just don't. All right, in closing, I hope this was informative to any budding data viz students out there. If you have any comments or critiques to anything I've said here, feel free to say so in the comment section or let me know at my Twitter at CJTDevil. Thanks for watching and happy visiting.